Our next topic is one that is used most commonly in terminal server and remote desktop server environments, although you can really use it anywhere when you have a situation where you need to apply the user half of group policy onto a computer and enforce those settings onto every user that happens to be logged onto that computer. And in fact, in order to do this, let's get out of that default domain policy here, because this is not a configuration you would ever want to apply to your default domain policy. Let's say, for example, that you have some remote desktop servers that are perhaps down here underneath your company computer's organizational unit. So company RDS servers here. But one of the neat things about RDS servers is they provide a single location for multiple users to log on to the same location. You can install an application once and be able to use that application by multiple people at the same time. But the problem with that is that typically your user half of any group policy you create contains all the settings that are important and relevant for that user's access to the server. So let's come here and actually create a group policy object here and then link it to this location. Let's call this configure RDS servers. Here for this group policy object, once we're working with it here, we'll take a look at both the computer side of the GPO as well as the user side of the GPO. Now, when you're dealing with these group policy objects, most typically you will configure either the computer configuration half or the user configuration half. But in the case of remote desktop servers, there may be configurations here under the policies view under computers that are relevant for these machines, but there may also be relevant settings down here under the user configuration as well. So for example, under, administrative templates here, we may want to configure the control panel. We may want to remove items from the display. We may want to tighten up or lock down the desktop, but we don't want to necessarily focus this on a user. We want to focus it on any user that is accessing these specific RDS servers. Well, normally you can't do this, except in the single situation when you configure what is called loopback processing. The loopback processing configuration happens up here under computer configuration, and it's back in the same location that we were dealing with before. So administrative templates here, system, group policy, and then under group policy, the setting is titled configure user group policy processing loopback processing mode, which is right down here. Loopback processing, whenever you configure it, has two different approaches, two different modes that you can configure for loopback, titled replace and merge mode. And it's in fact the very specific differences between replace and merge mode that can be really confusing when you first implement these. When loopback is configured in replace mode, the bottom of these two down here, the entirety of the configuration of the user half of this GPO replaces the entirety of the existing user configuration for any group policy that is applied to that user. So if a user has a group policy object that applies to them that has some user settings, configuring the loopback policy in replace mode will altogether replace those settings with those that exist here in this group policy object. This is different from when you configure merge mode, where the user's already existing user policy is merged with the settings that exist here in this policy applied to the computer. Now, if there are any settings that are in conflict when you're using merge mode, those settings that are here in the GPO applied to the computer will overwrite any that are applied to the user. So again, replace is used anytime we want an altogether replacement of any existing user policies, as opposed to if we want to merge the settings of the two policies together. In just about every situation, you find these associated with terminal services and remote desktop servers and exclusively those kinds of machines. But again, you could use loopback processing for any computer that exists in your environment.